Welcome to the Chapter 2 lecture on genetics, prenatal development, and birth. There is a lot of information, as you can tell, in this chapter. So again, I'm not going to be able to go over every little thing. I will give you an overview, and if you have any more questions, definitely let me know. For this chapter, I posted a lot of supplemental videos. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to show you videos in online, so you'll have to take it upon yourself to watch those. There's a lot of good ones in there. So while they're not required, I would encourage you to take the time to watch them. So we're going to start by talking about our genetics and our genetic foundations. So the first thing is chromosomes, which store and transmit our genetic information. We have 23 pairs of these chromosomes. So you might be familiar with this when we talk about sex chromosomes. So we know that with sex chromosomes, that's our final pair of chromosomes, so the 23rd pair. And if you have XX, that means you will be a female. If you have XY, that means you'll be a male. Now that's, for the most part, there are some variations there that we will talk about a little later. But that's your chromosomes. So like I said, they store and transmit our genetic information. So segments of our DNA are referred to as genes, and those genes are located along the chromosomes. And then finally, DNA is the substance of which our genes and chromosomes are made of. So we know, I'm pretty sure you know about genes and DNA, like the basics. That's all you really need to know. I'm not a biology professor, so I'm not going to go much more in depth than that, and I don't expect you to either. Your book does have a lot more information. It goes over things that you should have already learned in biology, like the Punnett squares. So we know the basic idea is that we know that whenever a human is formed, they get half of the DNA from their mother and half of the DNA from their father, and that DNA combines to create a new human being. So that's really what you need to understand about genetics, is that when we're talking about nature and nurture, that nature part is referring to the genes that we got from our parents. So what we in this class will be looking at is how our genes impact our development in different areas. So you may just think that, if you remember doing the Punnett squares that we would do for eye color, I can show you here. Let's see if I can create one. So if we had our Punnett square, if you remember, so let's say we're doing eye color. So the big B we'll do brown eyes. So let's say the big B means that you'll have brown eyes, and the little b means that you'll have blue eyes. So you have one parent that has one for brown eyes and one for the recessive gene of blue eyes, and the second parent has two recessive genes. So that would mean that, so this is dad. That means that dad has blue eyes right now because he has both recessive genes. And mom up here has brown eyes because this gene is dominant. This one is dominant. So that means she has brown eyes. So whenever they have a child, there's some variability in what color eyes the child will have. So here we have this combination. Here we have this combination. And then it repeats. So big B, ooh, that one got real big. Little b, little b, little b. So you can see that the child has a 50% chance of having blue eyes and a 50% chance of having brown eyes. So that's really easy to wrap your mind around about how we get our physical traits from our parents. But this also refers to how we get our other traits such as personality, certain types of behavior, temperament, um, all those kinds of things do have genetic foundations as well. So that's what I really want you to understand when we're talking about genetics, that it's not just determining your physical traits. So in class, face-to-face, I would have shown you this mitosis and meiosis video, but I cannot play it here through Blackboard Collaborate, so I posted it in that supplemental folder for chapter 2. So please watch that, especially if you don't understand the difference. It's really helpful in understanding what we're talking about here. The basic for what we're going to talk about right now is that meiosis is what the process that occurs whenever your cells are creating human cells, essentially. So whenever a child is being created in the womb, they're going through the meiosis process, the cells are. And what's important here is that next we're going to talk about some chromosomal abnormalities which occur during meiosis. So that's why you need to go back and understand either in your textbook or through the video what meiosis is. So this chart I'm showing you right now is in your textbook if you want to look at it a little further. But a chromosomal abnormality is something such as Down syndrome or Turner syndrome, any of these listed on here. There becomes an issue when the chromosomes don't separate correctly during meiosis or when a harmful gene is involved in the process. Okay, so I'll just talk about Down syndrome a little bit. So here on the description it says that Down syndrome is an extra chromosome, causes mild to severe intellectual disability and physical abnormalities. So what happens with Down syndrome specifically is that our 21st pair of chromosomes fails to separate during meiosis. So this results in there being 3 chromosomes instead of 2, which then creates these issues. So the severe intellectual disability and the physical abnormalities. So just because one set of chromosomes didn't separate correctly, it caused physical issues, cognitive issues, and eventually social and emotional issues as well. And it tells you some treatments here. You can do surgery for some physical abnormalities, stimulation, and different types of things. Basically, a child born with Down syndrome is going to need extra attention in schooling and those kinds of things. It gives you the incidence here. So what you can tell really quickly by looking at this is that women who are over the age of 45, really probably 40, have a greater incidence of having children born with Down syndrome. So something that's happening as we age is creating a situation where it's more likely that older women are going to have children with Down syndrome. So you can compare that to women age 20. And if you feel like going through the rest of these, definitely do that. I'm not going to go and explain each one. But again, the point I want you to get from this is that our development, becoming who we are, so think about yourself and who you are, that starts before you're even born. This starts before you're even a fetus. So this is all we're talking about right now is cells. So I want you to wrap your mind around that idea that even something as non-human as cells and how cells divide and form eventually what would become a fetus is impacting who you are going to become. That's kind of crazy. So, for example, if your cells or chromosomes, I'm sorry, are not separating correctly, that might mean that you're born with Down syndrome. And now think about for a second what some of the effects of Down syndrome would be. So we know that there's physical limitations, physical abnormalities. We know that there's cognitive limitations with the intellectual disability. Most people born with Down syndrome, their IQ is below average. Now, what kind of social and emotional effects is that going to have? Do you think this person is likely to have a lot of friends or have issues developing relationships, maybe feeling like an outcast? So, as you can see, this is something that's going to affect the child when they're born and later on in life, and it all started at the cellular level. That's what I really want you to wrap your mind around. So it's really important for people to study these kinds of things. One reason is to kind of dispel myths. So with the XYY syndrome down here, this is where you are born with an extra Y chromosome and it can cause above average height. Now, there used to be a myth that if you had XYY, you were a serial killer, because it made you more aggressive. So psychologists who have studied this syndrome have found that that is not true at all. So that's kind of dispelled the myth. So people who are born with this don't have to deal with that stigma. And there's other examples of that too in some of these other ones. But another reason it's important to study this is because then we can figure out ways to deal with this. So our genes, as we know, are not our destiny. Our environment matters too. But when we have genes that are completely missing, that are not functional, that are mutated or associated with disorders, these can create really big genetic flaws. And so it's important for doctors to be able to predict an individual's risk of developing some of these disorders and to be able to recommend healthy practices and prescribe the most effective and the safest drugs, and start early intervention. Now, this knowledge, being able to perform a prenatal test and determine if a child is going to be born with Down syndrome or one of these other disorders can bring a lot of benefits as well as important cost. So think about what some concerns might be associated with knowing your child's full genome really early on in the pregnancy. Some issues might be designer babies, people going in and creating a child to look and have certain personality types. Another concern for some people might be abortion, that if a child shows a genome that parents don't want, they might abort the child. I'm sure you could think of some others as well. Um, this is where I would really like you to watch the Last Week Tonight video on gene editing. It has a lot of information your textbook doesn't have, and it's so funny. It's a HBO show, so it's pretty entertaining. But the next thing we're going to talk about is reproductive challenges and choices. So as an expecting parent, there are some challenges and choices that you would have to make. So one of them, the first one we're going to talk about, is prenatal diagnostic testing. So this is how doctors are able to look for those abnormalities that we just discussed. So prenatal means that the child is still in the womb, and you go to doctor's visits, and they would be able to perform different types of tests to tell you certain things. Like, I'm sure you know that you can get tests done to determine the gender of the child. You can look at how the child's growing. You can determine if you have more than one fetus in your womb. You can determine physical abnormalities. And now with these genetic tests, you can determine parts of your child's genome really early on. So one of the choices you will have to make is how much prenatal diagnostic testing you actually want to undergo. So some tests can have risks for the mother and the fetus, but they can be beneficial as well. So the most popular one, and the one you probably know of, is an ultrasound. I have that picture right here of what an ultrasound looks like. So this is a relatively popular and low-risk test, and it can give you clues to the sex of the fetus, and you may be able to determine some physical abnormalities as well. You can also see if there's more than one fetus in it. If an ultrasound if an ultrasound does detect an abnormality, it's typically recommended that the mother then does a fetal MRI, which can be used to get better pictures of the fetus. So that's a second option if you think something is wrong, to really determine that. There's another option called chorionic villus sampling. So this is a test that can detect the genetic defects and chromosomal abnormalities we previously discussed. There's also another one called maternal blood screening, and again can identify pregnancies that are at risk for birth defects. But these tests do pose some threat. They may cause miscarriages. So again, that's the choice that an individual would have to make, is if they actually want to do this testing. Okay, so again, I would encourage you to go back and watch that gene editing video. But for now, we're going to move on to another reproductive challenge and choice and talk about infertility and reproductive technology. So not everybody is able to conceive a child naturally for many reasons. So there are some choices. I'm just going to talk about one, the most common one, which is in vitro fertilization, or IVF. So what happens here is that a doctor would combine an egg and a sperm in a laboratory dish. And if the eggs are successfully fertilized, then at least one of those eggs is transferred into the woman's uterus. So they take the egg and the sperm, they combine them in a laboratory dish, wait for them to be fertilized. If any of them are fertilized, they take at least one of them, usually more than one, and then implant that fertilized egg into the woman's uterus. So that's one option for people who are not able to conceive on their own. Another option would be adoption. So there are some there is some research we could talk about on adoption. So for the most part, adopted children tend to fare better than children who are in long-term foster care institutions. So if you are a child who's put into the foster care system, you're taken away from your family or something like that, you're living usually in a foster home with a foster parent who has more than one foster kid usually, or their own children as well. So you're usually not an only child as a foster child. And in that period, you're waiting for someone to adopt you. So children who are adopted do fare better than children who stay in foster care for a long period of time. They may jump around from family to family or institution to institution. So adopted children are, despite this, adopted children are at higher risk for aggression, anxiety, depression, and attention problems. Internationally adopted children had a higher level of mental health problems. However, again, most children adjust well after being adopted. There was one study in China that found that an infant's cognitive development improved 2 to 6 months after being adopted from their foster homes and institutions. So for a second, I want you to think about why we might see that increase in cognitive development after being adopted. Maybe a second to think about it. So it most likely is tied to the fact that once a child moves a foster home, they're getting a lot more individual attention. So having that individual attention, the care, the nutrition, having someone simply just talking to you all the time really spurs cognitive development in infancy. It's really important. So that's why we see the increase there after being adopted. Okay, so we are going to move on now to talking about let's see, some more prenatal development stuff. So real quickly, I just wanted to show you this slide of the phases of prenatal development. This is in your book, and I posted two different links, these two links here in that supplemental page that will give you videos so you can actually see the different phases of development. But what we're going to talk about now is hazards to prenatal development. So what we're talking about here is teratogens, which are really anything that causes harm to a fetus during the prenatal period. So I have some suggestions listed up here of things that might cause harm. So when we're talking about the mother's diet, if she is not eating enough, not eating properly, that can affect her health as well as the fetus's health. It might lead to obesity, which may lead to obesity in the fetus. It can lead to blood pressure issues and other issues as well. The mother's age, so we already talked about how older mothers are more at risk for having defects in pregnancy. Also, mothers who are extremely young are at risk for things like premature births. So mother's age can have an effect on the fetus as well. Prenatal support. So this could be things like having health insurance, being able to go to a doctor, having emotional support from a partner or friends. Those things are really important for reducing stress. Which stress can have a big impact on the fetus ill, and I posted a video on that for you to watch again in that supplemental folder. The mother's health. So if the mother gets sick, it's may cause issues with the fetus as well. So it's important for her to stay healthy. Of course, you probably already know the effects that drugs and alcohol, as well as smoking, can have on unborn babies. So taking drugs, drinking alcohol, smoking, these can all cause physical deformities, cognitive issues, possibly miscarriages or preterm births. So all of that stuff, that's why you were told to avoid that when pregnant, because it can have really serious issues. Even legal drugs, so like Tylenol, may cause issues. If you're still on birth control, you don't know you're pregnant, that can cause abnormalities as well. I want you to think about how fathers may impact a mother's prenatal development. All of this stuff is about the actions or behaviors of the mother. So how do the fathers play into that? I'll give you a second to think about it. So one way fathers may have an impact is their amount of support. So they may cause stress or they could help decrease stress. They may be smoking, which can cause issues as well. If they're drinking before they actually get pregnant, if there's drinking or doing illegal drugs, that can actually mutate his sperm, which would then maybe cause difficulties in getting pregnant or cause abnormalities as well. Also, this doing drugs and alcohol may lead to abusive behaviors and just more stress in general, which can affect the mother's health. So those are some things to consider that may have impacts on a fetus, which again is going to affect that child for the rest of its life, most likely. So this is a chart that's in your textbook, and it shows you the different time frames on, so this is the period of development that the fetus is in and what kind of effects teratogens would have. So you can look at this in your textbook, but you can see like here's the central nervous system and then heart and arms. So there's right here, you can see that there's going to be major structural abnormalities if a teratogen is used really before the 8th week. So if you're drinking during the first few weeks, you're going to have major structural abnormalities here. So you can look at that chart and kind of see there. Okay, so let me see where I want to skip to next. Okay, so we're going to talk about birth now for a little bit. So here is a chart on the stages of birth. So there are 3 different birth stages. So let me, sorry, skip to my notes on birth here so I can get you all the information you need. I will post a video of this as well so you can watch the birthing process. But basically what happens in stage 1 is that the water breaks and contractions start. So you could kind of see that happening here. In stage 2, what happens in stage 2 is that the baby is actually born. So once the baby fully exits, then stage 2 is over. All that's happening in stage 3 is that the placenta is exiting. So some people get confused thinking that stage 3 is when the baby comes out, but that actually happens in stage 2. Stage 3 is the placenta is leaving. I also posted this next video on hypnobirthing for you. It's a different birthing technique. So there are some different ways you could give birth. Hypnobirthing is a newer one. I'll let you watch that video on that. The traditional way to give birth in the USA is in a hospital. So 90%, 99% of our births in the US occur in hospitals. This isn't the case across cultures. So in some cultures, people give birth at home most often. We have had a raise in that here in the US, but it's mostly or upper class non-Latino white women who give birth at home, probably due to SES status. I'm assuming they are, and just having the knowledge of that's an option. In order to give birth at home, they probably have a midwife. A midwife is a medically trained professional who can help with the birthing process. Now, a lot of women choose to have a midwife even if they give birth in a hospital, because a midwife does more than just the medical side. A midwife offers social support. They also offer support before birth. So, prenatal period, they can help you with things like hazards to avoid. If you are having any kind of issues or questions, they will help you with that. They also help you in the birthing process, even if you're in a hospital, because in a hospital, your doctor will come in and check on you every now and then. Your nurse will check on you every now and then. But for the most part, you're alone in there, other than if you have any family. And a midwife will stay with you through that entire process. Also, the midwife will stay with you, stay helping you at least after you've given birth. Especially if you're a first-time parent, you're going to have a ton of questions, and a midwife can help you through that process. So a lot of women are choosing to do that now, even if they give birth in a hospital. But if you give birth at home, a midwife can be there and actually help you through that birthing process. You don't have to have a doctor at home, but you would need the midwife. In addition to midwives, there's also doulas. Doulas are not medically trained, so you couldn't just have a doula if you were doing a home birth because they are not trained to help you give birth. But the doulas provide the social and emotional support in the same way that midwives do. So if you are planning to give birth in a hospital with your doctor, you might not need a midwife. You could just get a doula who can provide that emotional support and education. So in your textbook, it talks about some other different cultural differences in birthing practices. Those are really interesting, so you should read through those. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is the infant mortality rate. Um, so 6.17 deaths per 1,000 live births. That's in the US. The rate for African Americans is nearly 19 deaths per 1,000 live births, so much higher than the rate for white babies. And in general, the US has a higher infant mortality rate than other countries. So usually in class, we would have a discussion about why you think that this is the case. Some reasons for the infant mortality rate we have. Our hospital system is not set up to help women give birth necessarily. Doctors that do this are trained as surgeons, so there may be some issues there where they are essentially overdiagnosing problems. They're seeing problems where there really aren't some, and they may be giving more C-sections, which can cause issues for both the fetus and the mother, which may lead to premature death. Um, the access to healthcare in our country may be causing more premature death, especially for lower income families, which would affect African Americans more than white families. So those may be some issues why we see this premature death rate here in the US. There is more information on this and some of those other cultural things in your textbook that I would encourage you to read. But I've come to the end of the lecture for today. So like usual, if there's something I didn't touch on that you have questions on or you want more explanation, please let me know either in office hours or through email.